And welcome into Friday's edition of LCPioneers.com Live, presented by PioStream, as we continue to keep you connected with student athletes, coaches, alumni, and members from the Lewis and Clark College community at large, 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific Time on Facebook Live, and available to watch on demand at LCPioneers.com and on our YouTube page, youtube.com/LCPios. Hello, I am Ryan Goff. I am the play-by-play voice and director of athletic communications for Lewis and Clark. We are the Pioneers out of Portland, Oregon, and members of the Northwest Conference, competing with 19 intercollegiate athletics programs in the Northwest Conference against other institutions from throughout Northwest Oregon and the state of Washington, and with over 430 institutions across the country competing at the NCAA Division III level, a chance for our student athletes to go across the country in competition, especially as soon as we can. Again, right now, the Northwest Conference suspending competition through at least January 1st, 2021, amidst the coronavirus pandemic. We are excited, though, to talk about something that's happening this month. It's the Environmental Studies Symposium, and we will bring in Professor of Environmental Studies, Director of Environmental Studies, Jim Proctor, to talk about that event. This is the 23rd annual symposium, and as I've mentioned, these are big events across campus, regardless of department, but because the Environmental Studies one is coming up in just a couple of weeks, we're excited to talk about what exactly the symposium provides for students in terms of on the planning side and the also engagement side, being involved with it and having a chance to have this happen, plus how this year's will look different. I mean, we're working in a virtual environment right now because of the pandemic, so we'll get that information from Jim in just a few moments. We do invite you to get involved in the show. You can in our Facebook Live comments below, and email us anytime, sports@lclark.edu. You can let us know of other guests you want to see on the show. We would love that feedback, plus a chance to get involved with us on Twitter and Instagram. We are LC Pioneers on both of those handles. And next week is our Hall of Fame week. As part of our Homecoming at Home celebration across the Lewis and Clark College community, we will have individual inductees interviewed all next week on LCPioneers.com Live. You can read about the incoming class, the class of 2020, on our website right now, LCPioneers.com. And that's exciting because we'll include the 1983-94 men's basketball program. We have an inductee coming in for meritorious service, another for lifetime achievement, and as soon as we can safely do so, an in-person induction for the class of 2020, hopefully sometime this upcoming spring. And then, as I mentioned before, we have our playlist updated on YouTube, youtube.com/LCPios, of all of our past shows. Big thanks yesterday to men's track and field senior Logan Kyle for joining us on the show. So let's bring in our guest for today, the Professor and Director of Environmental Studies at Lewis and Clark. We welcome in Jim Proctor to the show. Jim, appreciate taking the time to join us on this Friday and close out our week talking about Environmental Studies Symposium. I'll bring that up in a second, but let's start with this. We ask most of our student athletes, our alumni, why they came to Lewis and Clark. What was your background and how you became part of the faculty at Lewis and Clark College?
Thank you, Ryan, for having me. It's great to be here, and it's just great to speak to student athletes. I was a student athlete myself. I actually still teach a PE course, Ryan. I don't know if you know that, so I'm still involved, and appreciate those of you who come to Lewis and Clark and pursue both. I came to Lewis and Clark in 2005, but actually I grew up in rural Southern Oregon. I had graduated from Oregon. I had spent 4 years in Africa in the Peace Corps. I came back. I went to more school and more school. I eventually got my PhD in Berkeley and taught in California, but I saw the light, found Lewis and Clark, and came and took a position as director of the Environmental Studies program back here in 2005, and it just brought me closer to home. I was real happy to return to the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, you mentioned being from Oregon initially and being at Lewis and Clark. We ask this about with our student athletes all the time about Portland, about the campus and all of the things that it offers. When you look at everything that Lewis and Clark provides students, what are some of those top 2 bullet points when you talk about some of the advantages of attending Lewis and Clark?
Well, certainly it's a very demanding liberal arts environment. So if you're here to stretch your mind, you're coming to the right place. That's certainly true in environmental studies, and we can talk more about that, how it expresses itself, in, for instance, in the context of our symposium. But let's say you're an athlete and you like to get outdoors. I mean, why not come to Portland? You've got everything. You've got everything here. And we love that. We are adventurous. That's why we call ourselves pioneers. It's just a great place to live as well as to go to school.
And that transitions into that environmental studies major. My first question to you, specific to the area of study, is to describe the field from an overall view, right? What is it that an experience looks like for a major in the environmental studies program?
The environmental studies is basically the liberal arts in a microcosm. What's the liberal arts? That's a funny thing. You hear you're doing a liberal arts degree and it sounds kind of dusty. What it is highly diverse. You get to study all kinds of different things at Lewis and Clark. To get your degree, no matter what your major, you will get a liberal arts degree. And the differentiating feature of environmental studies is all of that comes into the major. You're going to take natural science courses, you're going to take social science courses, you're going to take humanities courses, and you're going to learn how they weave together and apply to help you understand the environmental issues that we face in the world today. So it really is the liberal arts in a microcosm. Perhaps one more thing, I heard you use the word engagement a little earlier, Ryan. We really believe in getting out there into the world and helping you build the skills to engage successfully. So yeah, there are a lot of new concepts and new skills you're going to learn, but you're not going to leave as somebody who just can't connect with the world. We're going to help you learn how to connect effectively as a citizen and professional and scholar once you graduate.
Professor and Director of Environmental Studies Jim Proctor joining us on lcpioneers.com live. We're going to overview the symposium in a moment, but one thing that stands out about the Environmental Studies department is we ask all of our student athletes, what's your major going to be? And as they progress over their 4 years competing for Lewis and Clark, I've noticed, Jim, that a lot of people speak so highly of the Environmental Studies program. Do you have any stories, any specific examples of student athletes that you've seen shine through environmental studies?
Thanks, Ryan. Quite a few. I think the athletes who major in environmental studies are just more disciplined. They're practicing, they're working out. They've got to get to their homework. They've got to get their assignments and projects done. And actually, that's a great student to work with. They kind of know what matters. I'll mention two real quickly. They graduated a couple years ago. I think they were both distance runners, but we've had soccer players, we've had baseball players, we've had the whole gamut. These are both runners, Blake Slatengren and Corey Grenville. I think they were both distance runners, and they graduated in 2018. And I'm bringing them up because actually that was as seniors they graduated, but as second years, they played a lead role in organizing a very controversial session in our symposium that gave us an opportunity to think and possibly challenge some of the kind of glib language we use in environmentalism. In their context, it was all around sustainability and campus sustainability. That was real leadership. They actually brought that work with a third student to Washington, D.C. then in a couple years as seniors as part of our Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences annual meeting in D.C. That was a national conference. So I have seen our athletes shine. I've seen our athletes build and exhibit leadership skills. And I've seen them take the leadership and the dedication they have as athletes into and beyond the classroom as scholars. And it just makes me happy to work with athletes in environmental studies.
So, more broadly with the symposium, talk about why symposia exists at Lewis and Clark, specifically to environmental studies. What are some of the best things that come out of this event?
Quick background, we have a number of symposia on campus. They're all student organized. They basically are services to the Lewis and Clark and the broader community. Students cultivate and exhibit leadership roles in doing so. Ours is called Environment Across Boundaries, or ENVX, Annual Symposium. And by Environment Across Boundaries, what we're trying to do is something more than the standard environmental lecture you're going to hear everywhere. Particularly in Portland, there are lots and lots of good green resources, and our job is to do something more than that. So our students have the opportunity to really think beyond what they've already heard. This year is called Conservation Conversations. I keep saying that correctly. One day I'm not going to quite say it right. It's a tongue tire. Conservation Conversations. We're talking about contemporary conservation. I mean, how many of you care about the wild world, wild plants, wild animals, making sure they live full lives, their habitats? Of course, that's important to all of us. But contemporary conservation is filled with debate. There are lots of honest differences among people as to how to do conservation well. We're going to bring that into symposium in a highly interactive manner this year. And we're going to give students opportunities to connect with people around the world discussing conservation. So conservation conversations this year, contemporary conservation, highly interactive. We've had current students, prospective students, and former students work together since last spring to organize the events that we're going to have in just a couple weeks, October 19th through 22nd, open to the public, including yourselves.
And this is the 23rd year of this specific symposium, and you talk about these conversations, and I'm curious, as you've gone through creating the content for this year's version, especially given the virtual component, what are some of the things that you're excited about specifically for this year that may also last when things, hopefully sooner than later, return to normal?
Yeah, that's a great question. Everybody thinks of the current restrictions as restrictions. There are restrictions. Of course, campus life has changed, but just think of it. If you want to connect people, if you want to promote conversation, and you're going to do that online, you can expand your geographic breadth. You can expand the breadth and diversity of people who can access. Our symposium to date has been great, but the people who literally access it are those who can physically come to Lewis and Clark campus and attend a session. Now, if you can't, you can still participate. That's so great for us because to do global conservation, you've got to understand and appreciate and listen to the experiences people are having around the world. As one example, Ryan, we are partnering with an organization called Narrative 4, and Narrative 4 promotes global conversation, which, oh gosh, isn't that necessary in any realm of life, particularly an environment where there's lots of controversy? We will pair students and other members of the Lewis and Clark community with Narrative 4 network participants from around the world, from around North America, Europe, and the Middle East, and Africa. That's going to stretch us. We're going to learn a lot, and we can only do that if we're online. So we have other conservation experts who participate in our overseas off-campus programs, and they will be a part of a whole set of sessions called Conservation Around the World. At each step, we've got actually opportunities versus restrictions by going online. And so we're very excited about what's going to happen in a couple of weeks.
You're watching lcpioneers.com live, presented by PioStream. We're Tuesday through Friday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time on Facebook Live. You can watch all of our past shows on demand at youtube.com/lcpios. Jim Proctor is our guest today, professor and director of environmental studies. And you were kind enough to walk us through some examples of student athletes shining within your department, within the symposium, and certainly how a student can experience environmental studies and some of the things that they leave the program with. Specific to the symposium, from a leadership standpoint, how do students get involved? What are some areas where you really see them shine?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. It turns out that many of our students have particular skills they either have or wish to build, and that means we create many opportunities for students to play a role. Sometimes students will come in and they will help organize and facilitate a session. We did a summer conservation reading group online. Over 100 people signed up for it. Very vigorous participation with prospies, current students, former students, and some of our students are going to be leading follow-up discussions on those topics: conservation and coronavirus, conservation and race, conservation and a term for the contemporary earth called the Anthropocene, conservation in cities. Some students feel capable of really facilitating a conversation about readings. That's kind of hard. Now, some students don't. They want to do something else, and so they're good with social media. And they help us get the word out because, you know, if you have a great symposium and no one comes, then not much happens. And some have particular skills in social media. They really know how to make that work. Some really just want to meet and listen to someone else, and thus kind of restitch the fabric of the world again. That's that conservation conversations. And they will play a role as facilitators, having been trained through Narrative 4 to be a story exchange facilitator. So there are all kinds of different roles our students have. Some are really good at kind of herding other students into remembering things and organizations and spreadsheets. Some play a quieter role, and we've got room for all of them. They've been doing that since last spring.
Well, I really appreciate taking time to join us on the show. Let's close with this idea is kind of post Lewis and Clark, the outcome side of things, right? Portland is a great place to be in the environmental world. Lewis and Clark has a law school. There's lots of options post undergraduate years from Lewis and Clark. Jim, as you look at the outcomes of some of your students or some of the stories that you've seen since you've been with the department since '05, what stands out as some of the ways that Portland, the Pacific Northwest, really facilitates the outcome of an environmental studies degree?
Yeah, good question, Ryan. And if anyone wants to know where our environmental studies alums go, you can go to the environmental studies site, and we have stories, dozens and dozens and dozens of stories. And these are the real lives they live after graduation. Some do remain in Portland and the Pacific Northwest. Perhaps they grew up here, perhaps they didn't. Of course, students come from across the country and the world. Portland's not a bad place to live, though. So they live, of course, here during their time as students, and then they find opportunities, whether it's with nonprofits, whether it's with federal agencies, whether they're going to start a new entrepreneurial career, whether they want to be a farmer. It turns out that our last class, to give you just one example, Ryan, the two most kind of preponderant professions students wanted to kind of pursue after graduation was, and these are different, law and farming. So we take many, many students through environmental studies, and they head many directions after they leave.
It starts October 19th, the Environmental Studies Symposium at Lewis and Clark. Conservation Conversations. See, I was ready for it, and even I tripped it up. Jim Proctor, thanks so much for our time and previewing this event. We're really excited about it. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. We wish every one of you considers Conservation Conversations and environmental studies and Lewis and Clark College.
Thank you, Jim Proctor, on the show today. That was fun to talk about this event and everything that it provides the students of Lewis and Clark, and as he talked about, available to the public too, right? So this is a glimpse inside what's going on with just one degree program at Lewis and Clark, and because it's virtual, trying to find the upside in something that otherwise we'd prefer not to have existing, a pandemic. Being able to participate in something that maybe you haven't been able to do in the past because you can't be on Lewis and Clark's campus at the right time. Maybe you have an environmental studies degree from Lewis and Clark and you haven't been able to come back and participate. This is neat that they offer this. And I think from my perspective, one of my favorite events of the academic year is the Festival of Scholars. And it happens one of the busiest times of year for athletics at Lewis and Clark toward the end of April. But one of the best parts of that specific event is you get to go to different displays, whether it's a lecture or a poster share or a panel, where you get to see the student athletes and the students present some of the things that they've been doing over the course of their year or the course of their 4 years at Lewis and Clark. And it's a really neat experience, and this is the same kind of thing. We aren't going to have competition during the symposium this year, a chance for me to maybe tune into something that I wouldn't otherwise get to do. And we have posted the link to the schedule in our Facebook Live comments. We'll do the same thing in our YouTube description so that if you do want to see the schedule, it starts October 19th for the Environmental Studies Symposium. We will put that link there so that you have the chance to participate as well. A big thanks to Jim Proctor for joining us today. And next week, it is Hall of Fame week on the show. We are excited to have 4 of our individual inductees confirmed for the upcoming shows on the 13th through the 16th of October. It's part of our Homecoming at Home celebration, and we're still working on trying to add another to join us on, I think, the 15th, when Pablo will be here as the Meritorious Service inductee. We're working on Judy McMullen for joining us, hopefully coming up on Thursday as well. And then Jeff, Lindsay, and Bob are individual inductees into the Lewis and Clark Athletics Hall of Fame. We were not able to connect with Tama, but we will certainly do something with her in the fall before the end of the academic year, because in the spring, we're hoping that everything will work out so that we can have an in-person induction of our class of 2020 for the Lewis and Clark Athletics Hall of Fame. But that's our guest list starting October 13th with Jeff Miller, so be sure to tune in next week. You can also go to the Homecoming at Home webpage. Either go to lcpioneers.com, and right below the main stories that rotate at the top, there is a link to click with the Homecoming at Home logo, or you can always go to go.lclark.edu/homecoming. There's even events next week, so that if you are a member of the Lewis and Clark alumni base for any of our intercollegiate athletic teams, or you're a fan or a supporter, we'd love to have you join us for one of our 3 evening sessions where coaches and student athletes will gather And a Zoom registration is available on that website too. So it'll be an exciting event coming up next week, October 13th through 16th with our show, and 13th through 15th with those evening events. Be sure to go to go.lclark.edu/homecoming for more information. So to Jim Proctor for joining us, and you for watching, I'm Ryan Goff. Thanks so much for having fun with us. I hope you have a superior weekend and enjoy every moment, as we will catch up with you again on Tuesday, as we do Tuesday through Friday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time for lcpioneers.com live, presented by PioStream. Until then, goodbye, everybody.
I'm Ann Bentley. I'm an associate professor of chemistry, and in this research group, I supervise the 2 students working in the Rogers program this summer in our lab. The brown bag experience is a good chance for students to get experience presenting their work that they've done in the lab, especially to an audience that's not technical.
What's intriguing about the brown bag experience is it incorporates all of the Rogers program. So I'm able to hear people in the psychology department and what research they're doing, but it also gives us the opportunity to share our research with the greater science community at Lewis and Clark. And for incoming students, the summer program is really beneficial for getting opportunity in research. So I've had the opportunity for research in the past, but other students may not have the same opportunities. So it's nice to work in a professional lab setting and potentially have the opportunity to publish a paper, which looks really good moving on into doing professional research out in the field.
The students grow a lot during the summer in their ability to learn the techniques and apply the techniques and suggest their own ideas for what could come next and interpret their data. It's just a big, usually if they haven't done research before, they learn a lot in that short period of time.
My favorite spot on campus is like right outside the Dovecote, little benches, and there's flowers growing there, and you can get a little coffee at the Dovecote and sit there.
My favorite spot on campus is definitely the weight room. I get that everybody loves like the gardens or the manor house, but our facilities for athletics here are actually amazing too, and the weight room is definitely my favorite spot.
My favorite spot on campus would either be the glade outside of the athletic facilities or South Campus.
What is my favorite spot on campus? I really like the back porch of the manor house. It looks out on Mount Hood, and on a clear day, it's super beautiful just to sit around with friends.